And for more analysis, we're joined from Paris by Mr. Maher Firzli, Director of the EU Asian Center, and from Cairo by Mr. Khaled Dawood, Managing Editor of Al Ahram Weekly. Welcome to Q News. And I'll start with you, Mr. Khaled. Now, Iran's Supreme National Security Council has yet to decide whether to close the Strait of Hormuz per the Iranian recommendation. Do you think that it will follow through on this threat?
Well, thanks for having me. Again, I think the Iranian regime will have to think very carefully before taking this step of closing down the Hormuz Strait, even though this will very much harm international economy and the United States and its allies in the region. But at the same time, this will cause a lot of damage to the Iranian economy itself, considering that 80% of Iran's oil, especially the oil that goes to China and the rest of Asian countries, goes through the Hormuz Strait. So, I mean, again, that's why we saw the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in interviews he gave yesterday when he was asked particularly about this issue of Hormuz, and the possibility that Iranians might close it down in a very simple manner. He said that that kind of question should be directed towards the Chinese, and that the Chinese should play a role in convincing Iran not to take this step. So actually, I mean, closing down the Strait of Hormuz would be one of several actions the Iranians could resort to if they want to escalate the situation to, a very great extent. But at the same time, they definitely have to consider the consequences on their own economy, on their own country. And at the same time, of course, the possibility that taking such a step will result in even a harsher American response in terms of military strikes. And at that time, considering that many other world countries will be affected, perhaps that would open the door for some sort of a coalition against the Iranians. So, theoretically, it might sound like a very easy step to take that will cause a lot of harm to American and international interests, but at the same time, it will cause a lot of harm to the Iranians, and they have to think very carefully about such a step.
Mr. Maher, why is the Strait of Hormuz one of the world's most critical oil choke points, so strategically vital to the global energy trade?
I'm delighted to join you today. Fascinatingly, in ancient Iranian, in what they call early Middle Persian, Hormuz comes from Ahura Mazda, which is the god of gods of Iran, right? The supreme god of the Iranians, Ahura Mazda, and he's a god of fire and destruction. And I think it's a cruel irony that today, to retaliate to the strikes by the U.S. Air Force 2 days ago, the Iranians are threatening to use that card they have in their hand, which is closing the Strait of Hormuz. Why is it important? It's a very narrow strait. So it's something that can be closed quite easily on the cheap. So there's no need for Iran to add advanced ballistic missiles or F-35, fighter jets on the cheap using, small Zodiac boats and laying a few mines in the water. They can literally shut down the Strait of Hormuz. So they can do it easily. Roughly 23% of the world's export of oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz every day. More importantly, perhaps 18% of the world's daily exports of liquefied natural gas also goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And clearly, if it happens, who would it hurt? Would it hurt Israel and America? The answer is no. So who would it hurt badly? First and foremost, Europe and India and China. Now, you could say Europe is not a problem because they're not really friendly to the Iranian regime. However, India and China are quite friendly to Iran. India is very, very friendly to Iran for cultural, ethnic reasons. The Iranians and the Indians are practically the same people, right? They have very strong ties. And the Indian economy relies on imports of oil and gas, which goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Likewise, oil refineries in China rely heavily on that oil. And Iran today is lonely in its own neighborhood, which is the Middle East, Western Asia, and one of the only Middle Eastern country which supports Iran is Qatar. And Qatar ships a lot of natural gas through the Strait of Hormuz, LNG. And so by closing the strait, the Iranians would really hit Europe, Qatar, India, China. So it may not be very smart, but if they are desperate, if they are put in a corner, they may believe it's the only card they have left to play.
Mr. Khaled, after the United States strikes, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that Tehran reserves all options to defend its security. What other retaliatory measures might Iran pursue?
Well, so far, to be honest, it seems that the Iranians have taken the decision to retaliate against the American strikes by striking Israel. I mean, again, since the United States or President Trump ordered those strikes after a very, extended deception campaign, we saw Israel receiving an unprecedented amount of Iranian missiles that hit very hard targets within Israel, causing severe damage, whether yesterday or today. So probably, at least that's what we hear from the Iranian analysts and some experts on Iran. And even like there were some statements by Iranian officials that they will strike against Israel as the kind of advanced base of U.S. interests in the region. And the fact that actually without the Israeli pressure on U.S. President Donald Trump and the Israeli military campaign started on 13 June, probably would not have reached that point whereby U.S. President Donald Trump took this unprecedented step of targeting nuclear facilities, but definitely without enough precautions that those kinds of strikes would not cause massive damage, not just to Iran itself, but even to its neighbors. If we read the statements that are being released by some Gulf countries, including Qatar, for example, people there are entitled to worry about any radiation that might come out of those American and Israeli strikes. So although the United States maintain very close relationship with all those Gulf countries, they definitely don't want to see their region subject to radiation or even be set on fire in case the Iranians went basically extreme in their response to the American strikes and decide not just to close the Strait of Hormuz, but also to strike American bases that are very, very close in Qatar, United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Syria. About 40,000 American troops are spread very close to Iranian missiles, or even less than missiles. I mean, again, it's just across the Gulf. The Gulf, and it's within reach, very much within reach, and doesn't even require advanced technology or ballistic missiles or any of those sorts. So, I mean, again, the probably some expectations, though nobody can predict exactly what will happen, think that Iran will retaliate to the U.S. strikes by hitting hard at Israel until some sort of compromise perhaps.
And I want to elaborate on this point, Mr. Khaled, if you allow me. Now, if the U.S. escalates with further strikes against Iran, how could this destabilize the world economy?
I mean, it will definitely turn the entire economy upside down. I mean, just closing down the Strait of Hormuz is enough to increase the price of the oil barrel from the current levels of $65 or $70. Some people say to $120 and even to $200. And that definitely won't be any good news for Trump. I mean, again, Trump based his campaign and his reputation on the fact that he doesn't want to get involved in any outside adventures, especially wars in the Middle East. And right now, this kind of war is going to be very extremely costly to the world economy and the United States if the prices of the oil, the bumps in the gas stations in America gets very expensive, or if the Iranians really go extreme in their response and target American personnel in the region, which would definitely force the U.S. President Donald Trump to send American troops back to the region. Again, I mean, this has been a tendency within the United States since Barack Obama, basically, to pull out from the region, to end the extremely heavy presence that the Americans had after the occupation and invasion of Iraq. And since then, there's been even more and more tendency that we don't want to get involved in any more wars in the Middle East. So it's not just the economic price, but I mean, again, just listen to the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that he's speaking about unimaginable levels of violence and destruction that will occur in the region if everybody, Iran, Israel, the United States, decide to go to the extreme in their confrontation against each other.
Mr. Khaled, allow me to continue with you. Now, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaya Kallas has warned that closing the Strait of Hormuz would be extremely dangerous. How might European powers react to further escalation in the region?
Well, to be very honest, the only maybe thing that I can trust the American president on, Mr. Trump, is that the ball is between the United States and Iran. I mean, there's very little that the Europeans can do, practically speaking, in this kind of situation, more than what we've heard from the European foreign ministers in their meeting today, calls for de-escalation, appeal all parties to practice maximum amount of self-restraint. But if you remember, just like one day before the American president decided to attack Iran, there was a meeting between the Iranian foreign minister and European counterparts. And when Trump was asked about that European mediation effort, he totally excluded it. And he said that the Iranians do not want to talk to the Europeans, they want to talk to the Americans. So the Europeans, of course, will be among the parties that are going to be very much affected by the possibility of deterioration of the international economic situation in case this confrontation escalates, including the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But at the end of the day, the final decisions are going to be made by Washington, by Tehran, and by Tel Aviv.
Of course. Mr. Maher, what would be the global economic fallout if Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, in your own opinion?
So I think it would hurt the most Europe, including the UK and Asia. You know, the situation is already a bit fragile in the Asia-Pacific area because of the trade tensions of the past 2 months since President Trump started his liberation trade war in early April. If you look at Germany, just 3 days ago, the French government published their revised GDP growth estimates, and that was like half a day before the US strikes on Iran. And right now, officially, the French economy is supposed to grow at 0.2, 0.3% this year. And it's really bad. It means that practically zero economic growth in France right now, while the debt to GDP ratio is abnormally high at 100%. So that's before the crisis. Add to that potentially, possibly the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and a rise in the price of oil and gas, imported inflation, right? In that case, Europe importing, quote unquote, inflation from the Strait of Hormuz. That would be horrible, because that would be hitting the European economy at the wrong time, precisely when the growth engine of the German, British, and French economy seems to be broken, precisely when they are no longer able to generate positive economic growth. So if you hit them with inflation and further trade disruptions, it would be really horrible. And war is not only that, it's also logistics. So if the war persists and expands, Iran is a big country. Israel is a fairly important country. So if European airlines, Asian airlines, including, cargo, freight, airplanes, cargo planes transporting goods and services, right, above the sky of Israel and Iran, if they can no longer fly above that part of the world, well, guess what? Because of the Ukraine-Russia war, they no longer fly over Siberia and Russia. So if you add Siberia, the Black Sea, Russia, Iran, Central Asia, Israel, you have like a third of the world where you have war zones and the airplanes, including the cargo airplanes, transporting goods and services, can't even fly over. That's horrible for the world economy and horrible for open economies like Germany, Britain, France, or Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, because these economies rely on trade, rely on a
Yes.
peaceful, open world.
Yes. Mr. Maher, you just raised a very interesting point to me, but I also want to ask you, how might the impending expiration of Trump's reciprocal tariffs compound economic uncertainty amid rising Middle East tensions, since we're talking about the economic impacts?
Well, I think the Americans very poetically and cruelly called, I think, their operation in Iran 48 hours ago, Midnight Hammer, right? So I think that there is the possibility, there's a fairly high likelihood that in the coming weeks, Europe will be taken between two hammers, the Chinese hammer and the American hammer. Why? Because to make a long story short, Trump signed kind of a trade deal formally with the British government, and he also got an informal trade deal with China.